On a foggy August morning in 1628, in the grimy port town of Portsmouth, the most powerful man in England lay dying on the floor of a tavern. Blood pooled beneath George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, as he gasped his final breaths. Above him stood a war veteran with a knife, shouting that he had saved the nation. But miles away in London, when news reached King Charles I, the monarch collapsed in grief so profound that courtiers feared for his sanity. For this was no ordinary assassination. This was the violent end to one of history's most dangerous love affairs between a king and his favorite. George Villiers was born around 1592 into minor Leicestershire gentry, the second son of a family with more ambition than fortune. His father, Sir George Villiers, had died when the boy was young, leaving his mother Mary to navigate the treacherous waters of Jacobean society with little money but considerable determination. According to contemporary accounts, young George possessed an almost supernatural beauty that set him apart from his peers. Historians suggest that his striking features, combined with natural grace and charm, became the foundation upon which he would build an empire of influence. In 1614, a group of ambitious courtiers seeking to break the political monopoly of Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, identified 21-year-old George as the perfect weapon. Court records indicate they spent considerable sums preparing him for presentation to King James I, teaching him languages, dancing, and the subtle arts of courtly seduction. Their investment would prove more successful than they ever imagined. If you're fascinated by the dark secrets of royal courts and the dangerous games of power and desire that shaped history, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories like this one. The moment that changed English history occurred at a hunting party in Apperthorpe in August 1614. Contemporary chroniclers describe how King James I, already 58 and notorious for his weakness for handsome young men, was immediately captivated by George Villiers. The king, who had previously shown favor to several male companions, had never encountered anyone quite like George. Within weeks, court observers noted that His Majesty could barely take his eyes off the beautiful newcomer. What followed was a transformation so rapid, it defied belief. From a virtually unknown country gentleman, George was elevated to positions of unprecedented intimacy and power. Royal household records show his swift appointment as cupbearer to the king, a role that granted him daily access to the monarch's private chambers. But this was merely the beginning of an ascent that would see him accumulate more wealth, titles, and influence than any royal favorite in English history. The established nobility watched in horror and fascination as this nobody from Leicestershire began reshaping the very foundations of English politics. But they had no idea that George Villiers was just getting started, and that his relationship with the king would soon scandal even a court accustomed to royal indiscretions. King James III had never been subtle about his attractions. Throughout his reign, courtiers had grown accustomed to the monarch's succession of handsome male favorites, from the scholarly Robert Carr to the athletic Philip Herbert. But contemporary witnesses describe something different when the king first encountered George Villiers. Court diarist John Chamberlain noted that His Majesty's infatuation surpassed anything previously observed, writing that the king seemed bewitched by the young man's presence. Within months of their first meeting, royal wardrobe accounts reveal extraordinary expenditures on George's clothing and jewelry. The king personally selected fabrics of silk and velvet, commissioning suits that cost more than many noblemen's annual incomes. Palace records show that George was granted apartments increasingly closer to the royal chambers, a progression that alarmed established courtiers who recognized the political implications of such intimate proximity. The speed of George's elevation defied all precedent in English court history. By Christmas 1614, just 4 months after his introduction, he had been appointed Gentleman of the Bedchamber, a position that granted him exclusive access to the king's most private moments. Contemporary accounts describe how James would summon George at all hours, dismissing even his most senior advisors to spend time alone with his new favorite. The role traditionally held by men of the highest nobility had been handed to someone virtually unknown just months earlier. It was during this period that historians believe the most intimate phase of their relationship began. Surviving correspondence between James and George, discovered centuries later in royal archives, reveals a language of startling intimacy for communications between a monarch and his subject. The king addressed George as Steenie, a reference to Saint Stephen, whose face was said to shine like an angel's. In return, George called the king "your dear dad" and "gossip," using terms that suggested a relationship far beyond formal court protocol. The letters, authenticated by royal historians, contain passages that leave little doubt about the nature of their bond. James wrote of missing George's presence, "more than any man can miss his own right hand," and described how he longed to live eternally with you and your worthy son. These documents suggest a relationship that contemporary society could only whisper about in the darkest corners of the palace. Court observers began noting changes in the king's behavior that scandalized even the jaded nobility. Spanish ambassador Diego Sarmiento de Acuña reported to Madrid that James's public displays of affection toward George exceeded anything acceptable between monarch and subject. The king was observed kissing George's hand, touching his face, and engaging in what diplomatic correspondence delicately termed immoderate demonstrations of favor. But while the court gossiped, George was methodically consolidating power that would make him untouchable. And soon, even those who whispered behind their fans would discover that the beautiful young man had transformed from the king's plaything into something far more dangerous, the true ruler of England. The relationship between King James I and George Villiers defied every convention of royal protocol, yet it flourished in plain sight of a court that dared not speak its name. By 1615, palace servants reported that the king refused to conduct morning audiences without George present, and that important state business was often delayed until Steenie could be summoned to the royal chambers. What had begun as physical attraction had evolved into something far more complex and politically dangerous. The intimate letters between the two men, preserved in the British Library, reveal a bond that transcended the formal boundaries between monarch and subject. James addressed George not merely as a favorite, but with the tender language typically reserved for family. "I naturally so love your person, and dearly cherish you in my heart," the king wrote in one surviving correspondence, adding that George was "as necessary to me as my food." These were not the words of a king to his courtier, but of a man utterly devoted to another. George's replies, while more cautious in their language, demonstrated his understanding of the immense power his position granted him. Royal historians note how skillfully he balanced intimacy with respect, signing letters as "Your Majesty's most humble slave and dog," while simultaneously making requests that would have been unthinkable from any other subject. Contemporary observers, like Sir Anthony Weldon, describe George's ability to wind and turn the king like a top, suggesting a level of influence that alarmed seasoned politicians. The transformation in George's status was nothing short of revolutionary. Treasury records show that by 1616, he was receiving annual grants worth over 80 $80, equivalent to millions in modern currency. More significantly, he began accumulating titles at a pace that shocked the established aristocracy. Knight of the Garter in 1615, Viscount Villiers in 1616, Earl of Buckingham in 1617, Marquess in 1618, and finally Duke in 1623. Each elevation represented not just personal advancement, but a redistribution of England's political hierarchy based entirely on royal favoritism. What made their relationship particularly scandalous was James's complete abandonment of royal dignity in George's presence. Foreign ambassadors reported witnessing scenes that would have been shocking between any two men, let alone a king and his subject. Venetian envoy Zorzi Justinian wrote to the Doge, describing how James would lean on George's shoulder, pinch his cheek, smooth his ruffled garments, and kiss his hands in public. Such displays violated every principle of monarchical authority and masculine conduct in 17th century England. The political implications were staggering. Traditional power brokers found themselves excluded from influence, replaced by a system where access to the king required George's approval. Established noble families watched in horror as this upstart accumulated estates, monopolies, and offices that had been hereditary for generations. The Earl of Suffolk complained that the king's love was become so fixed upon this young man that all grace and favor was tied to his mediation. But George's appetite for power was only beginning to reveal itself, and soon he would discover that controlling a king was merely the first step toward controlling a kingdom. The question was whether England's ancient institutions could survive the ambitions of a man who had learned that beauty and charm could topple centuries of tradition. By 1617, George Villiers had achieved what no commoner in English history had ever accomplished: complete control over royal patronage and access to the throne. Court records reveal that not a single significant appointment could be made without his approval, transforming him into the true gatekeeper of English power. But George's ambitions extended far beyond mere influence. He was systematically dismantling the traditional aristocratic order and rebuilding it in his own image. The speed of his accumulation of wealth and property was breathtaking. Parliamentary investigations later revealed that between 1614 and 1623, George received lands and grants worth over $400, EU loans, making him one of the richest men in England. He acquired Burley on the Hill in Rutland, Dalby Hall in Leicestershire, and dozens of other estates that had belonged to noble families for centuries. Royal warrant books show that James granted him lucrative monopolies in everything from wine licenses to silk imports, creating revenue streams that would sustain his power for generations. His elevation to Duke of Buckingham in 1623 marked an unprecedented moment in English social history. Contemporary historians note that he became the first non-royal duke created in over a century, breaking a tradition that reserved the highest nobility for those of royal blood. The ceremony itself scandalized observers, with the king personally fastening the Order of the Garter around George's leg in a gesture that foreign ambassadors described as most unseemly for its intimate nature. But George understood that titles without teeth were meaningless. He methodically placed his relatives in positions of power throughout the government, creating a network that historians have compared to a shadow dynasty. His mother, now the Countess of Buckingham, held court like royalty. His brothers received lucrative military appointments, despite having no experience. His sister married into the nobility, further cementing his family's rise from obscurity to the pinnacle of English society. The established aristocracy watched in mounting fury as centuries of precedent crumbled beneath the advance of this upstart family. The Earl of Oxford complained bitterly that ancient bloodlines were being subordinated to the creature of yesterday, while the Duke of Suffolk wrote privately that George's elevation represented the overthrow of nobility itself. Their resentment would prove dangerous, but for now, they could only seethe in impotent rage. Tell me in the comments what part of this story shocks you the most so far. And if you're enjoying this documentary, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. George's true genius lay not just in accumulating wealth and titles, but in making himself indispensable to the machinery of government. Foreign diplomats discovered they could accomplish nothing without his favor, leading to a stream of bribes and gifts that further enriched his coffers. The French ambassador noted that, to reach the king, one must first satisfy Buckingham, effectively making George a toll booth on the road to royal favor. By his 30th birthday, George Villiers controlled more real power than any subject in English history. He had transformed from a beautiful nobody into the unofficial King of England, wielding James's authority while the monarch basked in his lover's presence. But with ultimate power came ultimate enemies, and soon George would discover that his meteoric rise had created forces determined to engineer his equally spectacular fall. By 1620, foreign ambassadors arriving in London faced a startling reality. To conduct business with England, they had to first secure an audience not with King James I, but with George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. Diplomatic correspondence from the Spanish, French, and Venetian embassies reveals that George had effectively become England's shadow king. controlling foreign policy with an authority that left seasoned diplomats bewildered. What had begun as a personal relationship had evolved into something that threatened the very foundations of English governance. The scope of George's political dominance was unprecedented in English history. Privy Council records show that by 1621, virtually every major government appointment required his approval. He controlled the selection of bishops, judges, military commanders, and even minor customs officials. Sir Edward Coke, the former Lord Chief Justice, complained privately that the Duke's nod carries more weight than Parliament's vote, reflecting the reality that England's ancient institutions had been subordinated to one man's will. George's influence over military affairs proved particularly controversial. Despite having no formal military training, he appointed himself Lord High Admiral and began directing naval strategy with disastrous consequences. Historical accounts describe how he overruled experienced commanders, leading to a series of failed expeditions that cost thousands of lives and emptied the royal treasury. The 1625 attack on Cadiz, orchestrated entirely by George against professional military advice, resulted in humiliating defeat and the loss of an entire fleet. His foreign policy decisions reflected a dangerous combination of personal ambition and political inexperience. Court historians note how George's obsession with matching European monarchs in grandeur led him to pursue expensive military adventures that England could ill afford. His simultaneous wars with both France and Spain between 1625 and 1628 stretched English resources to the breaking point while delivering no meaningful victories. Parliamentary records show that these conflicts required unprecedented taxation that turned public opinion decisively against both crown and favourite. The personal cost of such enormous power began to manifest itself in George's behaviour and relationships. Contemporary observers like Sir Symonds D'Ewes described how success had transformed the charming young courtier into someone increasingly arrogant and isolated. Foreign diplomats reported that George had developed what they termed an imperious manner that offended even his allies. The French ambassador noted that he bears himself as if he were himself a prince of the blood, suggesting that power had corrupted the man who had once charmed everyone he met. More dangerously, George's control over royal finances had created a web of corruption that scandalized Parliament. Investigation records reveal a system where offices were routinely sold to the highest bidder, monopolies granted to his favorites regardless of merit, and royal patents issued for personal profit rather than national benefit. Sir John Eliot accused him publicly of engrossing all honors and profits to himself and his followers, transforming government service from public duty into private enterprise. The growing opposition to George's rule was coalescing into something far more dangerous than mere court gossip. Parliamentary leaders were beginning to speak of impeachment, military officers whispered of mutiny, and even some members of the royal family had begun to question whether the favourite's influence had grown beyond all acceptable bounds. But George seemed oblivious to the gathering storm, secure in his belief that royal love would protect him from any threat. On March 27, 1625, King James V died at Theobald's palace, his final hours witnessed by the man who had dominated his life for over a decade. Contemporary accounts describe George Villiers maintaining a vigil beside the dying monarch, holding the hand that had elevated him from obscurity to unprecedented power. But even as James breathed his last, George was already securing his future with the new king, Charles I, demonstrating a political acumen that his enemies had fatally underestimated. The transition to Charles's reign revealed the true extent of George's transformation from royal favourite to indispensable political operator. Palace records show that within hours of James's death, George had positioned himself as the young king's chief advisor, exploiting a relationship that had been carefully cultivated over years. Charles, only 24, and lacking his father's political experience, found himself dependent on the very man who had shaped his understanding of kingship. Royal correspondence reveals that Charles addressed George with the same intimate language his father had used, calling him "my true and constant friend" and "Steenie," suggesting a continuity that shocked observers. George's influence over Charles proved even more comprehensive than his control over James had been. The new king, raised in the shadow of his father's obsession with the Duke, had never known a court without George's dominance. Historical analyses suggest that Charles's political education had been entirely filtered through George's perspective, creating a dependency that went far beyond personal affection. Foreign ambassadors noted with alarm that the young king seemed incapable of making decisions without George's approval, effectively ensuring that power remained concentrated in the same hands despite the change of monarch. The Spanish match controversy demonstrated both George's continued influence and his growing recklessness. For years, he had promoted the marriage of Charles to the Spanish Infanta Maria Ana, seeing it as an opportunity to enhance his own international prestige. When George and Charles traveled incognito to Madrid in 1623, diplomatic records reveal that Spanish courtiers were appalled by the Duke's presumptuous behavior. The Spanish ambassador reported that George comports himself as if he were the king's brother rather than his subject, and the proposed marriage collapsed amid mutual recriminations that poisoned Anglo-Spanish relations for decades. The failure of the Spanish match marked the beginning of a series of foreign policy disasters that would define George's later career. Parliamentary records show that his subsequent pursuit of a French marriage alliance for Charles proved equally disastrous, with French negotiators repeatedly insulting both the Duke's competence and his authority to speak for England. The marriage of Charles to Henrietta Maria of France in 1625 came laden with religious and political conditions that would later contribute to civil war. Military catastrophes under George's direction reached new depths of incompetence and tragedy. The failed expedition to Cadiz in 1625, followed by the equally disastrous attempt to relieve the Huguenot stronghold of La Rochelle in 1627, cost thousands of English lives and virtually bankrupted the crown. Contemporary military records describe commanders openly questioning George's orders, while parliamentary investigations revealed systematic corruption in military procurement that had left English forces poorly equipped and demoralized. But George's greatest mistake was his failure to recognize that his immunity from consequences was rapidly dissolving. Parliament was now speaking openly of impeachment, and even Charles's affection might not be enough to protect him from the storm that was gathering. The question was no longer whether George would fall, but how spectacular his destruction would be. By 1626, the parliamentary opposition to George Villiers had crystallized into something far more dangerous than mere political criticism. House of Commons records reveal that members were openly calling for the Duke's impeachment, with Sir John Eliot leading a systematic campaign to document George's failures and corruption. The charges were damning: abuse of office, embezzlement of public funds, incompetent military leadership, and what parliamentarians termed the grievous misgovernment of the realm. For the first time in his career, George faced opponents who could not be charmed, bribed, or intimidated. The military disasters of 1627 provided George's enemies with the ammunition they needed to destroy him. The expedition to relieve La Rochelle, which George had personally planned and promoted, ended in catastrophic failure that shocked the nation. Military dispatches reveal that over 4,000 English soldiers died in what contemporary accounts described as the most shameful defeat in living memory. Survivors reported that the Duke's strategic planning had been so incompetent that French defenders barely needed to resist. The commander, Sir William St. Leger, wrote privately that the Duke's ignorance of war has murdered more Englishmen than plague or famine. Parliament's impeachment proceedings in 1626 represented an unprecedented assault on royal prerogative and George's seemingly untouchable position. The articles of impeachment, preserved in parliamentary archives, accused him of procuring honors and offices through undue means, enriching himself through corruption, and conducting foreign policy to the dishonor of His Majesty and danger of the kingdom. Most devastatingly, they charged him with responsibility for military failures that had cost the blood and treasure of this realm without any benefit to the Commonwealth. George's response to these attacks revealed both his desperation and his continued faith in royal protection. Contemporary accounts describe how he threw himself on King Charles's mercy, appealing to their personal bond in language that reminded observers of his earlier relationship with James III. Court records show that Charles dissolved Parliament rather than allow the impeachment to proceed. But this constitutional crisis only deepened public hatred of the Duke. Pamphlets circulated illegally throughout London describing George as the evil genius of two kings and the destruction of England's ancient liberties. The isolation that accompanied George's fall from public grace extended even to his family relationships. Historical records suggest that his wife, Catherine Manners, had grown distant from him as his political troubles mounted. Their marriage, originally a strategic alliance to connect him with established nobility, had never been marked by genuine affection. Court observers noted that Catherine appeared increasingly reluctant to defend her husband's reputation, while their children were reportedly kept away from court to avoid association with their father's growing infamy. More ominously, reports began reaching George of threats against his life. Intelligence records from this period describe multiple plots against the Duke, ranging from aristocratic conspiracies to popular uprisings. Sir Dudley Carleton warned that the Duke's life is in daily peril from the hatred of the people, while foreign ambassadors reported that London streets were filled with talk of assassination. Yet George seemed incapable of recognizing the mortal danger he faced, continuing to appear in public with minimal protection. The most chilling warning came from an unexpected source. In early 1628, a mysterious figure approached George's servants with a prophecy that the Duke would not live to see midsummer. Whether this was genuine supernatural warning or insider knowledge of an assassination plot remains unclear, but soon a former soldier named John Felton would make that prophecy a bloody reality. John Felton was exactly the kind of man George Villiers had learned to ignore, a minor figure from the fringes of society whose grievances seemed insignificant compared to the grand politics of empire. Military records show that Felton had served as a lieutenant in George's disastrous expeditions to Cadiz and La Rochelle, witnessing firsthand the incompetence that had cost thousands of English lives. But unlike the dead soldiers who could no longer testify to the Duke's failures, Felton had survived to nurse a hatred that would soon consume them both. Contemporary accounts describe Felton as a man transformed by military service and personal disappointment. Born into minor Suffolk gentry, he had joined the army seeking advancement and glory, only to discover that promotion required the Duke's favor rather than merit. Pay records reveal that Felton's wages had been irregularly paid, leaving him in debt and bitter about a system that enriched George's favorites while impoverishing honest soldiers. His brother-in-law, Captain William Sunderland, had died at La Rochelle in what Felton believed was a needless sacrifice to the Duke's vanity. The parliamentary session of 1628 brought George's enemies closer to victory than ever before. The Petition of Right, passed despite royal opposition, represented a direct challenge to the constitutional innovations that had protected the Duke from justice. Parliamentary records show that members were now openly reading from a catalogue of George's crimes against the Commonwealth, with Sir John Eliot declaring that this man alone has brought the kingdom to the brink of ruin. The language of impeachment had evolved into something approaching a call for blood. George's response to these mounting threats revealed the fatal flaw that had always lurked beneath his charm, an absolute inability to accept that his power might have limits. Court observers noted that he continued to dress magnificently, spend lavishly, and treat his enemies with contempt, even as their attacks intensified. Foreign ambassadors reported that the Duke seemed convinced that royal favor would protect him from any consequence, displaying what the Venetian envoy described as a confidence bordering on madness. The warnings multiplying around George grew increasingly specific and urgent. Intelligence reports from this period describe credible threats against his life from multiple sources, including disgruntled soldiers, bankrupt merchants ruined by his monopolies, and parliamentary extremists who saw assassination as the only solution to an intractable political crisis. Sir Dudley Carleton wrote privately that the Duke walks daily among his executioners and knows it not, while even George's own servants began to express fears for their master's safety. Felton's transformation from disgruntled veteran to potential assassin appears to have accelerated during this period. Contemporary accounts suggest that he had been reading parliamentary denunciations of the Duke, becoming convinced that killing George would be an act of patriotic duty rather than murder. Witnesses later reported that Felton had been frequenting London taverns where soldiers gathered to curse the Duke's name, absorbing their rage and transforming it into a personal mission of vengeance. By August 1628, all the elements of tragedy were converging on the naval base at Portsmouth, where George was preparing yet another military expedition. He remained supremely confident in his ability to overcome his enemies through royal protection and personal charisma, never suspecting that among the crowds gathering to watch his departure was a man who had already purchased the knife that would end his life. The morning of August 23, 1628, dawned grey and humid at Portsmouth, where George Villiers prepared for what he believed would be his triumphant return to military glory. The naval base buzzed with activity as ships were loaded for another expedition to La Rochelle, an operation that the Duke hoped would finally vindicate his military reputation. Contemporary accounts describe George in an unusually optimistic mood. Dressed in his finest clothes and accompanied by a small retinue of supporters who still believed in his star. He had no way of knowing that among the crowd of onlookers stood John Felton, clutching a 10-penny knife purchased specifically for this moment. Felton had traveled from London with singular purpose, carrying in his hat a piece of paper that justified his intended actions. Witness statements later revealed that this document contained verses from parliamentary denunciations of the Duke, which Felton had copied out as a manifesto for his deed. He moved through the crowds at Portsmouth, unrecognized and unchallenged, just another face among the soldiers and civilians who had gathered to watch the Duke's departure. The fatal encounter occurred around 8 o'clock in the morning as George emerged from breakfast at the Greyhound Inn. Eyewitness accounts describe how Felton pushed through the crowd surrounding the Duke, using the press of bodies to conceal his approach until the final moment. Captain Mason, who was walking beside George, later testified that Felton suddenly appeared as if from nowhere and struck with such speed that no one could intervene. The assassination itself was witnessed by dozens of people, yet their accounts vary dramatically in detail. What remains consistent across all testimonies is the shocking suddenness of the attack and George's immediate recognition of his mortal wound. Captain Sir Thomas Fryer reported that the Duke cried out, "The villain has killed me," before staggering several steps and collapsing. The knife had penetrated his chest with such force that contemporary medical accounts suggest it reached his heart, ensuring that death would be swift and certain. Felton made no attempt to flee, standing calmly beside his victim as chaos erupted around them. Witness statements describe him as appearing almost relieved, declaring loudly, "I am the man who killed him," when soldiers moved to apprehend him. The paper in his hat, discovered immediately after his arrest, contained the words, "Let no man commend me for doing this, but rather discommend themselves as the cause of forcing me to do it," suggesting that he viewed his actions as patriotic duty rather than personal revenge. The immediate aftermath revealed the true extent of George's isolation even in death. While his servants wept and soldiers stood in stunned silence, many observers noted an absence of genuine grief among the witnesses. Foreign ambassadors reported that news of the assassination was received in London with what they described as barely concealed satisfaction among parliamentarians and common people alike. But the most profound reaction would come from King Charles V, whose response to his favourite's death would shape the next 2 decades of English history and ultimately lead the monarchy to civil war and execution. When news of George Villiers' assassination reached King Charles V, courtiers witnessed a breakdown so complete that it seemed to herald the collapse of the monarchy itself. Contemporary accounts describe the king falling into what royal physicians termed a profound melancholy that would define the remainder of his reign. Palace records show that Charles refused to see visitors for weeks, emerging only to issue increasingly desperate proclamations against those who had murdered our dearest friend. The loss of George would transform a weak but potentially manageable king into the rigid, paranoid autocrat who would ultimately face execution on the scaffold. The political consequences of George's death extended far beyond personal grief. Historical analyses reveal that the Duke's assassination removed the one figure who might have mediated between Crown and Parliament, ironically making constitutional crisis inevitable. Without George's political acumen, however flawed, Charles proved incapable of managing the complex relationships that had sustained royal authority. Parliamentary records show that within months of the assassination, the king had embarked on the personal rule that would alienate every major faction in English society. Charles's response to his favorite's death revealed the true depth of their relationship and its psychological importance to the monarchy. Court observers noted that the king began speaking of George in language typically reserved for martyred saints, calling him the truest friend that ever king possessed, and commissioning elaborate monuments to his memory. Foreign ambassadors reported that Charles seemed incapable of understanding why Parliament and people had celebrated George's death, displaying a complete disconnection from public opinion that would prove catastrophic. The broader historical impact of the relationship between George Villiers and two successive kings cannot be overstated. Their dangerous love affair had fundamentally altered English governance, concentrating unprecedented power in the hands of a single favorite and creating constitutional precedents that would haunt the monarchy for generations. Parliamentary historians argue that George's dominance established patterns of royal favoritism and arbitrary government that made civil war virtually inevitable. More profoundly, the story of George Villiers reveals how personal relationships at the highest levels of power can reshape entire civilizations. His rise from obscurity through royal love had demonstrated that in a world built on hierarchy and tradition, genuine passion could overturn centuries of precedent. But it also showed that such transformations come with devastating costs, not just to those directly involved, but to the societies forced to accommodate them. The tragedy of George Villiers was not that he loved or was loved by kings, but that neither he nor his royal patrons understood the limits of what love could accomplish in the face of political reality. His assassination marked the end of an era when personal relationships could determine national policy, ushering in the modern age of constitutional government forged through civil war and revolution. In the end, the beautiful nobody from Leicestershire, who had captured two kings' hearts, became the catalyst for the destruction of the very system that had elevated him. His legacy reminds us that the most dangerous love affairs are often those that believe themselves above the constraints of law, tradition, and popular will. If these hidden stories of power, passion, and political intrigue fascinate you as much as they do me, please subscribe for more documentaries that reveal the secret forces that shaped our world. History's most important lessons are often its most scandalous secrets.